What's up, everybody? I am Charlie Marlow. That is the great Eric Messersmith. This is Everybody Settle Down. Eric, great to see you. We always like to start the show now. We've decided to start the show with kind of what's going on with the polls. You sent me this article from The Hill, a polling average based on 130 polls. Trump and Biden in a dead heat, 41.3% each. This includes RFK Jr., who's at 7.7%. It is a dead heat, Eric Messersmith.
Yeah, it's a continuation of that slow pattern we've seen, and we talked about it a lot last week. I won't get into all the details again, but generally from the start of March until now, late April, Biden has incrementally made progress in the polling averages against Trump. It hasn't been a giant swing. He's still not ahead, as you said, but he's gotten it back to even, basically. You mentioned the Hills average, Real Clear Politics, they aggregate polls. In their polling over the last month, Trump is ahead by, I think, 0.3, which is essentially a tie. One thing I will note, though, in the polling, the national polling that I've seen that is a good sign for Biden, in addition to just kind of closing that gap, is there used to be a difference when you polled Trump versus Biden head to head, and then you did the five-way race with
Mhm.
RFK Jr., who's an independent, Cornel West, who's an independent, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. And when you did the five-way race, Trump did about a point or two better than he did in the two-way race, which made sense because Cornel West, Jill Stein, they're really far to the left. Even if they only get 1 or 2%, that's most likely going to pull for Biden, not Trump. But now the polling averages in the two-way and the five-way are kind of merging. And in fact, on Real Clear Politics, as I said, for the two-way, it's about a 0.3 difference. And for the five-way, Trump ahead by a little less than 1 point. So they're getting closer together, which is good news for Biden because it's not a guarantee with ballot access for Cornel West, certainly, and even for RFK. But if they do get the signatures they need, and RFK Jr. is already claiming his campaign, claiming they have them in some of these states like Michigan, then in these key battleground states, it is probably going to be a five-way race and not a two-way race. And so it's good for Biden that those polls are kind of merging and he's getting closer in both. Now, the good news for Trump is that, and I say this every week, if the election were held today, I still think Trump would win as of now. And the reason is because if it's tied nationally, which it probably is, that would lead you to believe Trump would win the Electoral College if you have a national popular vote tie, essentially. And in the polling that came out from Bloomberg yesterday, they did the 7 swing state polls. Trump is ahead by 8 points in Nevada, 7 in Arizona, 6 in Georgia, 10 in North Carolina. And Trump also ahead by 4 in Wisconsin. Now, Biden in this polling leads by 2 in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Trump up 1. So that is those results, if they were to hold, if they were accurate, that would mean Trump would win the election. And those polling results are pretty consistent with a national environment that's tied. If you just told me, hey, I think it's tied nationally, where do you think the swing states go? I would say, well, most of them are going to break for Trump. Not all. Biden probably will still win 1 or 2, but most will break for Trump, and that would give Trump the presidency. So that's probably where we are right now. The question is, of course, where will we be in 6+ months from now? The good news for Biden in the state polling is, as I said, he's ahead in Michigan, which is good to see because Michigan is critical, as we've talked about, to him winning. I mean, is it possible he wins the presidency without Michigan? Yes. That mathematically you could make it work, but it's very unlikely that he would lose Michigan and still win. So, and same thing with Pennsylvania. Those two, you could find a scenario where he could replace those electoral votes and still win. 19, I think, in Pennsylvania, 15 in Michigan, so that's 34 total. But man, it gets really tough to see it. He really needs those 34 electoral votes of Pennsylvania and Michigan, and then one more. He either Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, one of those three. That's the easiest and most likely path for Biden.
Okay, so if you're a huge fan of Everybody Settle Down, and there are so many thousands, if not millions, out there, you might be saying, hey, I watched your episode last week, and you said that Biden is ahead. And I say you, I mean both of us, we discussed this, that Biden was ahead in the election betting odds, which I just brought it up again. So for electionbettingodds.com, which also aggregates, we discussed this last week, it has Biden 45.9%, Trump 43.5%. And also in some of the states, for example, I just find this interesting. I think most people know, look, it's pretty much a coin flip. We don't know what's going to happen, but I do find it interesting because you said that Trump was up how many points in Nevada?
According to this one poll, he is up 8. But
Okay.
that is an out that it's in the average, it's much closer than that. That's a little bit of an outlier.
Okay. I think that's interesting because again, on the election betting odds site, they have Democrats in Nevada with a 60.5% chance to win Nevada. Basically, Arizona is razor thin. It's going to Republicans right now, and they still have look, Wisconsin very thin, but right now going towards Biden, and Michigan. Let's see, Michigan even better for Biden, 55.5%, and then Pennsylvania is 61.5%. So I guess my question is, why do you think there are pretty stark differences there? And again, I don't know how much it matters. It's fun to talk about. I still think it's a relative coin toss. But if one poll is saying that Trump's up, whatever it is, 8 in Nevada, and then election betting odds say actually Biden's doing pretty well in Nevada, what do you think is the truth or the closest to the truth?
Well, we tried to explain this on last week's episode, and maybe I didn't do a good enough job because I saw some of the comments. Although I don't think the people commenting necessarily watch the show, so because I think there is this perception out there, and I think it's mainly among Trump people that think some element of the Trump base that thinks there's no way he can lose, that he's way
100%.
ahead right now, and that he's not. That it's just not even in the realm of possibility. And part of that's probably because Trump says all the time, "I'm way ahead," and just like many things Trump says, that's not really true, right? And so if you live in that world, maybe you think that. But as we've said before, any fair reading of the polling shows you that this race is pretty close. Again, I want to be clear. I would rather be Trump today. We're recording this on April 25th. Up this whole year, up until and including today, I would rather be Trump in the polling heading into the election than Biden. But the difference again is polling measures where we are now, or more accurately, where we were when the poll was conducted. Because remember, polls come out they usually are conducted over the course of 3 to 5 days. Then they come out several days after that. So that's a snapshot in time. And that tells you where we are now. The betting markets are people wagering on where we will be. And that is the difference in a nutshell. And it's kind of what my theme has been all year. My theme of this race is the early stages favored Trump. As we get into the race, which we are doing now, we're starting to get into it. And as the split screen shows more and more Trump in court, legal problems, appeals to the Supreme Court, immunity, January 6th, and Biden on the campaign trail, I think people assume that we will continue to see what we've seen over the last month and a half, which is a gradual shift toward Biden. And if that continues, you certainly could see how Biden would be a favorite, albeit a slight favorite, to win the election. And that's pretty much where I am. The data I think is pretty clear that Trump would most likely win if we had the election today. But if I were projecting, and you told me, who do you think is the favorite to win? I would say Biden, but only, my personal odds would probably be 55-45, or maybe more accurately 50 Biden, 45 Trump, and 5% somebody else. If I were doing the odds, I think that's probably kind of how I would put it right now. I think it's close right now. And I think the most likely outcome is it's going to be close. But the difference is essentially the difference between a snapshot in time of where we are now, which is polling, versus predicting what will happen in the future 6 months from now, which is the betting markets.
Okay, you brought up something there which I want to touch on. And some people might say, "Oh, this is anecdotal," but I have now spent over 3 years really monitoring comment sections on YouTube a lot. And then,
God bless you.
thank
That's
you.
the Lord. That's the Lord's work right there, Charlie.
And a lot of them are sports, but now we're doing the political stuff. And you mentioned something that I think is 100% true. When I see the comments when we do videos on polling or betting odds, the comments that come from the right and the left are very different. Now, both of them can say, "Hey, we don't like Trump or we don't like Biden." That's the same. Or Biden's terrible, Trump's terrible. That's the same. What is different is if somebody's commenting on how they feel about the race, from the Biden folks, I hear things and I read things like, it's going to be close. We'll see what happens. Got to beat Trump, whatever it is. That's from, Biden fan 474 on YouTube. The
Right.
comments, and I'm just being real here. The comments from Trump fans are, this is BS. This is fake news. There's no way this is possible. It's going to be a landslide. Biden's the worst president ever, which, by the way, if you think Biden is the worst president ever, that's fine. You're okay to think that. You can think any way you want. But what I see is, I don't see a lot of people realizing the reality of, like it or not, this is essentially a coin flip. It's going to be super, super close. It's not going to be a landslide. Now, Trump could win pretty easily in the electoral college, and he may even win the popular vote. But I do kind of worry sometimes, because I wonder where some folks are getting their news, if they really feel like this isn't even going to be a contest. Because don't you agree? Like, it's going to be damn close.
Yeah, I mean, look, we talk a lot on this program about the silo of news and information. If you believe that this election is currently in a blowout position, or is likely to be that for Trump or for Biden, even, I would say either way. I just don't think there's much evidence you could base that on. I mean, you could wish that, you could think that, you could hope that. We're all entitled to believe whatever we want to believe. And maybe you're getting your information, if you believe that, from Trump himself, who always says, I'm winning in a landslide. It's a blowout, which, of course, again, isn't true, but it's what he says. And a lot of people listen to that. Look, if you think Biden's the worst president of all time, I mean, uh, James Buchanan would like to have a word with you. Like, there are presidents in history who were pretty bad, like really, really bad. I have my quarrels with Biden. I would not consider him a great president, based on 3 years so far. We'll see if he gets a second term. But to put him in last, no, come on. So that, but you're right. It also sets a really bad eh, precedent, and it's a potential bad sign for the future, because let's say that Trump does lose and it's relatively close, maybe a rerun of 2020. Now, people already, many of them, and we see this in polling, a large number of Trump's base thinks the election was stolen in 2020. Many of them, again, think, as you correctly stated, that he can't lose this time. What does then that lead you to believe if he does lose? That it must be illegitimate, right? And that is the groundwork that I think Trump, intentionally or not, and I think it is probably intentional, is laying, just like he did in 2020. Remember, the election stealing that Trump attempted to do actually began before the election in 2020. He carefully, in the weeks leading up to the election, basically said, and I think he really actually did say it at one point, if I lose, it won't be fair, right? It won't be legitimate. And so he set the groundwork for that, the predicate. And now I think a similar thing is happening with the, I'm way ahead. This thing's over. It's in the bag. I can't lose. And so again, that sets the predicate for, if he does lose, him saying, well, this isn't possible. They stole it from me in 2020. I was way ahead all year, which again is not true, but it's what he says. And now they're stealing it from me again. So that is something legitimately to worry about. I don't think every Trump supporter, I just talked to a Trump supporter the other day who actually thinks the opposite, who doesn't think he will win, who thinks that he will lose no matter what. So it's not everybody in Trump's orbit, but you're right. You see it with a large number of people, and it's a scary sign potentially for the future. And the thing is, getting back to a second for the difference between the polling and the forecasting. What would lead you to believe that the polling today, or that we saw last month or the month before, won't necessarily be how it turns out on election day? Well, one of the things, and I keep pointing to this, is Nikki Haley's vote. And we talked about this a lot when she was actually still in the race. Of course, she dropped out the first week of March. So she has not been campaigning, no ads, no visits to states, no get out the vote effort for, what are we on now? Almost 2 months. Pennsylvania, one of the states we're talking about that's going to decide this election, had their primary on Tuesday, my home state, original state. Nikki Haley got 120,000 votes, almost 20% of the vote. That Pennsylvania is a closed primary. What that means is in order to vote in the Republican primary, you have to be a registered Republican. Democrat primary, you have to be a registered Democrat. So this wasn't Democrats crossing over to try to interfere in a primary, in part because nobody was campaigning, right? Trump wasn't campaigning. Haley wasn't campaigning. This thing's over. We know Trump's going to be the nominee. So these were registered Republicans. Now, some of them, I'm sure, voted for Joe Biden in 2020. I want to be clear. I'm not saying they were all Donald Trump voters, but they're Republicans in one of the states that's going to decide it. And 120,000 of them voted for Nikki Haley, who's not even in the race. Well, I mean, what does that tell you? That tells you that there are a large number of, again, registered Republicans around the country. Whether they consider themselves Republicans or not is a different argument. Many of them sure do, some don't, who are not sold, to say the least, on Donald Trump. And by the way, the margin in Pennsylvania in 2020, Joe Biden won it. It was 80,000 votes. So Joe Biden beat Trump in 2020 by 80,000 votes. Nikki Haley, in an uncontested Republican primary, got 120,000 votes. So if you want to point to the things that could lead one to believe why the results in the fall may be different than what we're seeing in the polling right now, these are the kind of things you have to factor in. And I think the thing about Trump's many, many legal issues, whether you agree or disagree with whether they should have been brought, is a factor as well.
And I think another thing that's happening is I do believe that Joe Biden is performing better. He's clearly doing more. Now, maybe it's also me paying more attention, but let's be real. There was a stretch of several months where I feel like all that I saw from Joe Biden was either falling down off his bike, up the stairs of the plane, reading the teleprompter, really bad moments when he walks off the podium, he shakes fake people's hands or doesn't know where to go, right? Like it did seem like there was about a full year where every time I saw Joe Biden, it was a gaffe. And then he didn't do the Super Bowl interview, right? And you're just wondering, are they really, really hiding him? He comes out. And I think if you're being fair, he did pretty dang good or better than expected or higher than the bar, or whatever you want to say, State of the Union. And this is me as a person who I'm not locked in every night watching politics or reading politics every day. But what I see on social media, I'm seeing more little wins for Joe Biden. Like, I'm not seeing him fall down as much. Now, he still might fall down tomorrow, right?
Right.
But I'm seeing
Absolutely.
so here's a good example. Yesterday, I saw some people on X, ripping on him because I guess he said pause and the pause was in the teleprompter. So he does that.
Yes.
It's not
He
good.
read the word pause when he should have
Right.
just
And
paused.
that's what he's doing. That's what he's doing.
Right.
The other thing though is I saw him up there. Now he does look very old. Let's be real. He looks old, but he had a nice little funny line where he said, "Yeah, Trump with his Bible. I had almost bought one of those damn things to see what was in there." Right? And again,
Right.
maybe the bar's low, but I'm like, that's a pretty good little
Yes.
line. So what I'm trying to say though is I feel like Biden really did, and I'm not even talking about inflation and anything like that. I'm saying just his public perception and presentation was really bad for a 6, 9 month stretch. And I feel like it's been better in the last 2, 3, 4 months. What do you think?
Oh, there's no question about it. I would say since that State of the Union week in early March, since then, and I think that is a big part of why he has seen some, I don't want to overstate it, movement in the polling in his direction. Look, you and I had these conversations, and I remember I said it might be better for the Democrats to have somebody else, but I'm not convinced it is, and Biden deserves a chance to show that he can still do it at the level necessary to win an election. Now that some of that's in the eye of the beholder, but it's kind of like, you know it when you see it. And it wasn't good. The signs were not good with the Super Bowl, with the Her report, with that press conference he had after the Her report. By the way, that's when his betting odds were at their lowest level. It was after the Her report and after he did that impromptu press conference where he was really angry and he confused the president of Mexico for the president of Egypt. But since then, you got to give credit where credit is due. If you're trying to be fair, and it's a double-edged sword for Biden because on the one hand, the bar is really low, and a lot of the stuff about his age is now baked in. This is not a scandal that will emerge in the summer out of nowhere, where
Mhm.
all of a sudden we go from nobody talking about his age to everybody talking about it. That's not going to happen. People have been talking about his age now for, well, hell, since he ran the first time, but really in this campaign for a year now. So at this point, and as we get into the summer, it gets baked into the cake to a large extent. It's either a huge problem for you or it's not. And it's not probably not going to change much unless something really bad happens. A stumble, a terrible fall, a major health issue, a Mitch McConnell type freeze where he doesn't talk for a minute. Like barring something like that, I think it's baked in. The downside is everything that does happen, like the pause moment where you mentioned yesterday, just his general slow gait where he just moves really slowly. I mean, I think he has
Squinting.
squinting. He's old. I mean, the guy's really old. Okay. And so when he acts old and looks old, which is a lot because he is old, now all of a sudden that's clipped up, shown on social media, and it plays into the pre-existing narrative, right? That's the downside, is it feeds the narrative that we already have in our head. Biden is old. And sometimes in presidential elections, for people who don't pay very close attention, the narratives decide things. Like that's kind of, they're not, some people really care about issues and they're weighing in on them or they're reading them and researching them. But a lot of people, it's a vibes thing. And the vibes on Biden is he's old and he's slow and he's not quite what he used to be. And all that is true, right? But I get back to what I said before. Biden, this is not a referendum. Presidential elections are choices. People look at the candidates and they make a decision weighing them against each other. But Biden's not running against a healthy, vigorous, 45-year-old. He's running against a man in his late 70s who, although appears to be, maybe more mentally sharp at times than Biden is, has his issues. I mean, we've seen clips of Trump rambling and talking nonsense and being incoherent. Now, I don't know if that's age related or just kind of, the way he talks sometimes, but either way, those are the two choices, right? There's not Biden on one side and like a, bodybuilder who's in his 50s on the other, who's like a Mensa member. Okay. Those are not the choices in this election.
Yeah, that's where I think sometimes in the comments, I don't think probably both sides don't really realize the apathy. Now, I do think there's more energy for Trump amongst the base, but I do think both sides really dislike the other. And it is really two weak candidates for
Yeah,
different reasons. I don't mean weak being
absolutely.
feeble. I just mean percentage wise. Everybody's like, oh, okay. And that's where, look, you mentioned earlier about, Biden, he deserves the chance. I did, and I still wish Biden wasn't running, and we've talked about that forever. But now we're at the time where, hey, we're going to break down the race. This is what it is, and so let's talk about that. Now, let's move on to the Trump trial going on, and I'm just wondering what you think. First of all, what do you think of the trial? But also, what do you think the impact will be? It's one of those things where I feel like we already kind of knew what was going on, right? I think most people realize, okay, Trump, he did this. Okay. It's something that is election interference if you're paying it off. I wonder how much people care. I don't know if I care. I'll be honest. I'm not really paying attention to it. And I wonder if anybody else is. I mean, do you think it has an impact? Do you think people care?
I think some people care. I think of the four trials, this is the least damaging to Trump. If he was going to have one to go first, this would be the one he would choose because the underlying allegations are not nearly as severe as the other trials. And I think this is just a tougher case legally for the prosecution than the other trials. I think if you were doing likelihood of conviction of the four trials, I've heard legal experts say this, and I think it's true. I mean, based on I'm not a lawyer, but just looking at it, I think Trump has a chance to be acquitted in this case. Like he has a real chance to win. The other three cases, there's a chance, but I think it's going to be more of an uphill climb. So this would be the one you would want first because there is a chance this is the only one we have this year. And that would be the dream scenario for Trump is if convicted or not, if this is it. And one of the things that will decide that also played out today on a split screen. So you had the David Pecker, by the way, great name because of his job, especially. He was in charge of the National Enquirer back in the day, Trump's first run. So David Pecker has been on the stand all week talking about the scheme that he and Trump and Cohen cooked up to catch and kill these stories, including Stormy Daniels, which is what this trial is about, is the hush money payment to her. So he's on the stand now. Of course, it's not on trial or not on TV because it's a federal court. It's in New York State court. They don't allow cameras in this courtroom, so it's not on trial. But that's happening, and at the same time, the audio this morning, if you were watching the news, was playing on all the news channels live from the Supreme Court for Trump's immunity claim. And that relates to what we've talked about before. I feel like is the most serious trial and potentially the most damaging to Trump, which is the federal case against his efforts to overturn the election and the events of January 6th. And so that case is on hold right now until Trump's claim of presidential immunity is decided at the Supreme Court. Today was the hearing. The decision will come sometime between now and the end of June. If the Supreme Court strikes down his claims of immunity, which a lower court already did, then that trial probably happens this summer. But if the Supreme Court doesn't, or if they send it back to the lower court, which if you watch the hearing today, reading the tea leaves, it looked like that might be the way that a majority of the court may go, is to say, we're not ready to decide this yet, send it back to the lower court to reconsider some of the legal issues. If that happens, it's hard to imagine any world where this trial happens before November, which to me, just for democracy's sake, I think it would be nice if we had this trial, win or lose. But also, it would be nice if the Supreme Court were just to decide this issue. Like, this is a big deal. And it's because it's not just for Trump, but for future presidents, because the question essentially is a president immune legally from pretty much anything they do in office, as long as it's an official act. And an official act, based on what Trump's lawyers say, is pretty much anything. I mean, they asked again today in the Supreme Court argument. This happened in the appeals argument, where they brought up what are crazy scenarios, but are illustrative of the point, where they said, okay, what if a president ordered the assassination of his political opponent? Is your argument that he would be immune from criminal prosecution? And during the appeals court hearing, his lawyer said, yes, unless he's impeached first. And today, Sonia Sotomayor, the Supreme Court, asked Trump's attorney, John Sawyer, that question again. And Sawyer said, quote, that well could be an official act, meaning an assassination order of a rival could be an official act, meaning you couldn't prosecute him unless he was impeached. I mean, think about that for a minute. I mean, that is insane. That is insane. So we are saying, they brought up other things too, like taking a bribe to appoint an ambassador, well, all the things you could imagine. And essentially, the argument of the Trump camp is, as long as it's not an official act, which is basically anything the president does outside of their personal life, you couldn't charge them unless they were impeached. And that question, I get it that it's complicated because you have to draw a line. You're setting a precedent for the future. And so it's a complicated case in that regard. But the central issue of whether a president should have absolute immunity, to me, is it's a no-brainer. Of course not. Like, we don't have a monarchy. Of course not. And this idea that it's okay to then prosecute as long as they're impeached first, if people remember the impeachment of Trump, the second impeachment that happened after he left office in the early months of 2021, one of the arguments his lawyers made, and one of the arguments that some of the senators, I heard Mitch McConnell say this, who voted to acquit Trump in that trial, said is, well, the legal process can handle it. Whatever he did here, it's not a political crime. It's the legal process. And now what our lawyers are arguing is the exact opposite. They're saying, no, you can't do anything legally. You have to do it politically through impeachment. And so think about how ridiculous that is. Those two arguments now, if you put them together, there is no remedy legally, and there's no remedy politically for anyone who tries to overturn an election. That is bananas. I mean, that is just crazy. And that's what some of this stuff is about with these trials and with this immunity thing, and even with the impeachment, is Is the argument then that if someone tries to overturn an election, that as long as they don't use force, right? As because I think we all agree, like if Trump had like a militia that took to the streets and started, way worse than January 6th, right? I think we all would agree, okay, fine, that's too far, right? But are we essentially saying that as long as nobody's killed, that you can do anything to try to overturn an election, anything, and as long as nobody's killed, that it can't be you can't be held criminally liable for it and you can't be impeached for it. So what do we do then? We just say, well, you can only try to overturn a coup if it happens, right? Like only after the fact. So imagine Trump had been successful and he stayed in office. Then I guess you could say, well, then you could bring charges to court and try to go through the process there. But of course, by then it's too late, right? It's too late because the person who did it, Trump or somebody else in the future, has essentially won. So when you think it through, it just defies logic. If it can't be prosecuted and it can't be impeached, then then basically you're saying we're powerless to stop any attempts at someone trying to stay in office even though they lost an election. That is just crazy to me.
Yeah, especially let's be real about impeachments now too. It's not about whether the person did it or not. It's all political. And that's a big part of this. If you're going to look at one hand and say, okay, well, the impeachment process is going to handle this. Look, I don't think it's going to get better moving forward. We're we're way
Right.
partisan now. I think it's going to get even worse. I do think back in the day there was more decorum of right and wrong and more reaching across the aisle. If somebody really did something wrong, I think even go back to Nixon when he resigned. Now, maybe he didn't want to, but nowadays that would never happen. Nobody would resign. They would go to
Yeah.
war and they would have
Right.
50% of the country and 50% of the media going to war with them. So, yeah,
I
times
think
are
we have
crazy.
I think we have this idea because like America, because we have such reverence, most people, for the Constitution and for the rule of law, we think that these things are like foolproof. And here's the thing, the Constitution's not that long, and we have a lot of laws, but we don't have laws for everything. And the reason for that is obvious, is because you don't write everything down, right? First of all, you can't imagine every possibility. Secondly, a lot of what we do in America is not based on the Constitution. It's not based on a specific law. It's just based on common sense and people acting appropriately, right? There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of like, Nixon lost the 1960 election, and some people think Kennedy's, Mayor Daley switched votes in Chicago. Nixon could have said, no, I won this election, right? Al Gore after 2000, when you essentially had a tie, and Florida had the hanging chads, and who the hell knows who won, right? Al Gore lost in the Supreme Court. He could have said no. And he was the vice president at the time. He was the one in charge of certifying. He could have been like, no, I'm not certifying this election result. I won. And who knows what would have happened? Could Al Gore do that? It's not, it's unclear. It's gray. It's vague. That's a lot of what our democracy is based on. It's just people acting normal, right? And so when they don't, we don't have a good way to counter it. I would argue the best way is the political process. I think, look, I'll reserve judgment on if Trump violated the law when it came to overturning the election. I want to see the trial, but I know that he violated the duties of the presidency.
Hmm.
That I know, right?
Yes.
I know his crime was political. Was it a legal crime? I don't know. I'm confident and comfortable with our system letting a jury decide that, hopefully this year. But politically, that was his crime, and he should have been impeached, and he should have been convicted. And the ridiculous argument of, well, he'll face legal consequences later. Well, maybe not. But the point is, you had a chance to do the right thing there. That was our way to handle it. But what happens when, as you said, we become so partisan that we don't handle it that way? And that is why the great challenge of Trump is also the great opportunity, which is he has forced us to look into these gray areas of law and of our constitutional process in a way that nobody else before him has. And that's an opportunity. And Congress passed a law after January 6th that upped the threshold for objecting to the Electoral College, that clarified what the vice president's role is. Those are good things, right? And the Supreme Court has a chance here, and I hope they take it, to do something similar with this. We know this is a conservative court. We know it's a conservative majority. 6 justices appointed by Republican presidents, 3 by Trump himself. But they have a chance to, not just for Trump, but for anyone in history, to say, look, here is a line you cannot cross. Okay. You cannot be immune as president for anything illegal unless you're impeached. We just can't have that. And we've never had to deal with that. It seems so obvious, right? But we've never had to deal with it before. So once and for all, now we have an opportunity to say that so that we never have to wonder again, can a president just do whatever the hell he wants while he's in office?
Yeah, and I think you put that well. Even if you're not found criminally guilty, and this is kind of where I've always been with the subverting the election and January 6th. I saw what I saw, and I saw a protest, which a protest is legal, but it was advertised as 1776. What does that mean? That means you're overthrowing the government. I mean, you got your folks riled up on the one day where they're certifying the election. As people are actually starting to be violent at the Capitol and beating on police officers, and they're crushed between doors and whatnot, Donald Trump sat there. The first tweet was Mike Pence didn't do his job. That was the tweet that was
Yeah,
later deleted. I mean, what else do you need to, again, this isn't a court of law, but this is human beings just watching that and
right.
seeing that and saying, this is wrong. This has never happened before. No president has ever acted in the way that Donald Trump. And I don't know how you could argue against that one.
Yeah, and again, that's separate from the legal case. Did he
Yes.
break the law? I don't know. We'll see. We'll have a trial this year, but politically, there's no question that he. I mean, if a if a person tries to stay in office by basically any means necessary after they lose, that is all you need to know that they should never hold any office again. And it comes back to the argument of there's no accountability, right? Because if he can't be impeached because he might be convicted, but he can't be convicted because he hasn't been impeached. It's the same thing with like the charges against his criminal cases, right? One of the arguments against this New York case is this is a local prosecutor. Same thing with the Georgia case. They say, why are these local prosecutors, who some of whom have admitted they don't like Trump, they're elected, right? Some of them, how are they able to prosecute a former president? But then with the federal charges, they say, well, he can't be charged federally when it comes to January 6th or the documents because that's the Biden administration charging him, right? So he can't be charged federally. He can't be charged locally. He can't be impeached. He can't face criminal liability for anything he did while he was president. It's this bizarro world where there's never any chance for any accountability. And if you try for accountability, then you will face, oh, who knows what kind of repercussions, right? Who knows what may come down the pike if Trump is convicted with maybe denying the election or having a, God forbid, a repeat of what we saw in the post-election period of 2020. It's a bizarro world that we're living in 2024.
That's why I just wanted Trump to go away. And I don't want to see Trump on trial. I don't want to see any president on trial. That's why I just wish after January 6th he would have just went away. And I think, you hate to say it, but I think a lot of these lawsuits would have went away as well if
It's
Donald
possible.
Trump just kind of went and started to play golf and do his thing. Um okay. Let's talk about these protests been going on for a long time here with Israel Palestine. And the way I look at it, and then you have it going on in Texas here, and you saw some. You saw the TV photographer get what thrown down, then arrested, or whatever it was there. So I just, at first I'm thinking, oh, these crazy college kids on campus, right? They're always protesting something, and I don't know. It's weird because still, like, I don't want to say I live in a bubble, but like I don't see any of this in my daily life. It seemed at first it was all on the most liberal campuses in the United States of America. It's something that even if I'm out and about, I'm driving around, I don't know. What do you think? I just feel like it's gone on for a long time. It seems like it's growing. I don't know if it's going to have a huge impact on the election, but It's constant, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about it. Like, look, on the one hand, I'm very pro First Amendment and free speech, and I think people, should have the right, including college students, to say whatever they want, as long as they don't violate the law or the rules of the university. And so, for instance, I think you had two interesting cases: one at Columbia University in New York, and one at Texas at UT Austin. And you had different responses. Columbia, they've taken over with a tent encampment a part of the university. And that's against, from what I understand, the university policy. But rather than having them removed, which they did a few weeks ago, but not this current encampment, they're negotiating with the people to try to get them to give it up without calling the police in, because it's private property, so the police can't come in unless they're invited. And we have seen things where Jewish students have been harassed. There was a Jewish professor who wasn't allowed on the campus. I mean, you have seen some of the chants we've seen about, and they're not just pro-Palestinian; they're anti-Semitic. Some of them, and I want to be
Mhm.
clear. I'm not saying that's all the people. I'm not even saying it's most, but we've seen some of it, right? And we know that the tent encampment is against policy in the university. In that regard, I think you need to be tough and you need to say, look, you can say what you want, you can protest how you want, but you just have to follow the rules of the university, because we would do the exact same thing if there was a protest against any other country or for or against any other group. And we all can think of examples of that. UT, I think it's a little different. At UT, from what I understand, these protesters were peaceful, and the governor, Greg Abbott, sent the National Guard in almost right away. That seemed like a bit of an overreaction to me. A bunch of people were arrested, and also you had a reporter arrested from the local Fox affiliate there. And I just think on both sides, we have to come to an understanding, right? That it's okay to protest. We should allow that. But I think what happened, but we just you can't violate the law and you can't violate the policies of the university you go to. I think that's a fairly common sense way to look at this. And what happens with protests or speech in general that I see so many times is people's opinion of it and how much it should be policed often comes down to whether they agree with it. And I see example after example of this. And I even fall into this trap sometimes myself. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Imagine this was something that I had the opposite opinion of. What would I think? Would my view be consistent? And that's the important test here. It isn't whether you like the speech or not. All the speech should follow that same pattern. And so I think there's just a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to this issue in particular, but speech in general on both sides. It's yes for speech as long as it's the speech I like. Now, again, I want to make a clear distinction between what I'm talking about, which is protesting, advocating, and hate speech, anti Semitism, racism, going after people, attacking people, violence, all that stuff is beyond the pale. That should be dealt with. If they violate the law, they violate policy. But what I'm talking about is just protesting and speaking in public areas. That's what America is all about, whether you agree or disagree. And I want to be clear with a lot of the things I'm hearing from these Palestinian protesters, pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel, depending on how you want to view them. Probably both is fair. It's crazy. I mean, some of these people, they don't, they're so confused, right? And I hate to do they're young kids, they don't know what they're talking about, but there is some of that. I mean, there is some of that they really, there is this view that because Israel isn't perfect and because it has behaved in some ways that you may not agree with, and a few weeks ago I basically said I think Benjamin Netanyahu needs to go. I think he's been awful for Israel. I disagree with some of the policies of the Israeli government, but they're not the bad guys in this situation. The bad guys are Hamas and the
Right.
terrorists. And if you say things, it's America, and I want people to be able to say whatever they want. But if you say, with the exceptions I mentioned earlier, but if you say things that promote Hamas, October 7th, terrorism in general, or are overly critical of Israel in a way that isn't fair, I just think you are so misguided on who the good guys and the bad guys are in that fight. And we all have sympathy for the Palestinian people who are suffering innocently. Of course. Of course. The images are horrible. And when it comes to aid, could the Israeli government do more? I think they could have in the past, and I think Biden rightly pressured them to do more. And I think they are doing more now. But I just think when I look at some of these people and these protesters, although I freely support their rights, it just makes me more pro-Israel than I was before. Like, you know what I mean? I'm just like, you
Yeah.
guys are so over the top and just misguided in the way you view the world that it almost makes me even more pro-Israel than I was before. You've like, on me at least, you've had the opposite effect of what you were trying to do.
Yeah, and I also think most reasonable people just look at it and they say, Hamas, what they did was absolutely horrible. And of course, Israel has the right to defend itself and release the hostages and all of those things. But also, excuse me, but also, let's try not to kill as many civilians in Gaza. I think that's a pretty reasonable take that most people have. And I don't know. I think another part. So I'm reading this tweet from Greg Abbott, and he says, arrests being made right now and will continue until the crowd disperses. These protesters belong in jail. Anti Semitism will not be tolerated in Texas, period. Students joining in hate filled anti Semitic protests at any public college or university in Texas should be expelled. And to me, look, it gets back to what you said earlier, which is no, I don't want to say nobody, but I don't like anti-Semitism. I don't like KKK rallies. I don't like when you have like a neo-Nazi march. But unfortunately, or it's the way it is in America that you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to do that.
Absolutely.
I can hate that those people do that, and I can hate those people, but you are allowed to do that. And and the other thing is, I also just feel like big picture. I mean, I think about what I thought about. I know this is at Texas, but we're a lot of times talking about Ivy League schools. What I thought about Ivy League schools back in the day, I remember it's watching Saved by the Bell. They always talk about Harvard. This is a Harvard man. He went to Harvard, and I just feel like, is there any other institutions that have been really brought down in the last several years? I mean, you see some of the craziness going on at Ivy
Yeah,
League campuses. They really have lost control. They've
they
lost
have.
control. They have.
They have. And that ideology that you see, it's one of the reasons that Donald Trump does as well as he does and did as
Yes.
well as he did back in 2016. It's one of the people don't talk about it quite as much as some of the other stuff related to Trump and his appeal, but I think it's as big a factor maybe as anything else with the appeal of Trump. Is there are so many people that just can't really stomach that. And it's interesting because those people don't like Joe Biden either. I mean, they call him Genocide Joe. Like they're protesting. He's supposed to give a commencement speech at Morehead College, and there's a huge protest among the faculty, staff, students. They don't want him there. They harass him and call him Genocide Joe. So they don't really like Joe Biden either, but they're perceived to be part of the left because let's face it, they are left, extreme left. And so that what they have done, and I say they as like I would just say academia, in general, but particularly it's true at these elite schools, right? I don't think this goes on as much. Like I went to Penn State, you went to Ohio, you went to no, where did you go? Marquette?
Bradley.
Bradley. So
Bradley,
you
yep.
have, but you see some of these elite private schools or that used to be considered elite and are academically, but and it's just there seems so out of touch. But getting back to what you said about Governor Abbott, saying all that, I would like him to clarify that. It is when he says throwing people in jail, if they're trespassing on private property, yes, fine. But nobody's going to jail for being anti-Semitic. That is not a crime. It's not a crime to be anti-Semitic, just like it's not a crime to be racist or sexist or homophobic or say offensive things. And it shouldn't be. This is the United States of America, okay? Nobody should be going to jail. Now, again, if they violated university policy by saying things in their students, that's a different thing, but that's not a legal issue. So we don't throw people in jail in this country for, having views we don't like. And we shouldn't be breaking up protests because people have views we don't like unless they are specifically violating a law and being where they shouldn't be. Okay. That needs to be the standard, whether you agree or disagree with the speech that you're seeing. And I wish Governor Abbott would clarify that, right? Yes to illegality. Let's break that up. But no, we're not doing it just because we don't like their speech.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about how sometimes it's more about the narrative. And I was laughing because, and I'll be the first one to say, I need to pay closer attention to all of this stuff. And sometimes I do get it through the feed of X. That's really the only social media I look at besides YouTube. And I'm laughing because these extreme leftists, they've lost the narrative, because you'll see some man on the street interviews. I don't know if you saw the one, but they're they're interviewing two girls, and they're like, two college girls, and they're like, "Why are you protesting?" And they didn't know why. They didn't know why they were protesting. They're like, "What specifically? No, what that your college is doing specifically are you protesting?" And the one girl goes, "I don't know." And she turns to her friend. She goes, what are we protesting? What are we doing here?" Right? Like, just, I don't know, stuff like that. And you're just seeing you're seeing a lot of craziness out there, and it is just so easy to be like, these people are cuckoo, and then you can very easily just attach them to the left and Joe Biden, which I do find funny because, look, I understand that nowadays it's just right versus left. I mean, if you really look at Joe Biden, I understand he has a very progressive left that's pulling on him to try to do a lot of different stuff, but he's pretty centered. He really is. He's a compromiser. I mean, he's compromised a million times. I think there's a lot of normal, reasonable people who just, they want some government compromise. He's willing to make deals. I mean, 80-year-old Joe Biden is not some radical leftist. He's freaking Joe Biden.
No. Although I will say he is more it is fair to say that he has moved left. I mean, Joe
Sure.
Biden
Yeah.
today is not the Joe Biden when he was in the Senate 20 years ago. He wasn't a conservative then by any means, but he was closer to the middle. He has moved like smart politicians do with their party. And he really has. He has evolved with his party. But you see in the way, look, it's so interesting that Joe Biden has gotten so much flack from anti-Israeli people, Genocide Joe, and from the pro-Israeli contingent, mainly on the right, who think he has abandoned Israel. And I think it is so interesting that both sides are so angry at him and feel like he has completely betrayed them. And what that says to me is that he's in the right spot. When I see the two extremes in this country, on that issue or any issue, both have so much hatred and vitriol towards somebody. I think they're probably balancing it correctly, and I think that's generally where Biden has been. Remember, Biden has not called for an indefinite ceasefire. He said he thinks it would be nice if Israel had a ceasefire for 4 or 6 weeks to get some aid in. He definitely wants to see a deal with the hostages, but he's not said Israel should lay down their arms. He's not said they shouldn't finish off Hamas. Hell, America, we were there when Iran attacked to shoot down, 99% of all those missiles. He has been a friend to Israel. But what he has said is, hey, look, here's some things I think we should do differently, particularly when it comes to getting aid in to the people who are really suffering in Gaza. And here's some things we should do. And I think that's probably where I am. And I think that's where most reasonable people who aren't, extreme on one side or the other are. And I think that the anger that he has engendered by both sides of this debate shows you the passion of each side and what they believe, but also kind of where Biden has been on this.
Yeah, and when I say, I do think he's pretty, though, in the middle in terms of 2024 America. The dude is 80, right? And I know you
Right.
said he's not the same as 20 years ago in the Senate, but the quote about the racial jungle quote, which we've all seen, and look, it's a very bad quote. These dudes are 80. I'm not saying
Right.
it's
That was from
right.
this. And that
That's
quote
what
was
I'm
that from the
saying.
70s? Yeah, it was a
Right.
long
I
time
mean,
ago.
we're talking about language was different back then. Words you could use back then. And I'm not trying to you know, try to say it was right. But we're talking about a dude who's 80 years old, and Trump is close to 80. And Trump
Yeah.
used to be pro-choice, and now he's pro-life. And look, I'm not even knocking either of them. I'm saying, look, if you don't change from when you're 20, 30, 40
Yeah.
to the time you're freaking 80. I mean, you should change. The world has changed, and everybody gets, you might get a little more left, you might get a little more right, but also the country changes as well.
And look, I defended Biden, but also I have an issue with him, and I think on this topic, and I think one of the issues with Biden is that he has an opportunity, I think, because of these issues we're talking about, and because he has essentially clinched the Democratic nomination now, he has an opportunity to do a little bit of a pivot, right? Not become a different politician, but this anti-Israel and, let's be honest, anti-American attitude that we see by many people on college campuses, some of the extreme things we see about the transgender movement when it comes to making biological boys, allowing them to play girls' sports. Some of the drag queen story hour thing we see, that's been in the news. Drag queens reading stories to little kids, like this obsession that some, again, I want to be clear, on the left have with gender identity for a 5-year-old. Like we need to make sure they know some of that stuff. Biden has a chance, I think, to blunt it and to have kind of a like Bill Clinton when he ran in '92. There was a rap group named Sister Soldier who put out a song, and I think it was about the police. I don't even remember the details. All I know is that it was really offensive to a lot of people, and it was perceived to be someone on Clinton's side, right on the left, and Clinton came out hard against it. And that is what I think Biden has an opportunity to do with Israel, specifically in this issue with these campus protests. Like he could say, and he put out a statement, which was fine. I'm against anti-Semitism. He said a few things here or there, but he has a chance, I think, to come out forcefully, either in front of the camera or go to the university. Mike Johnson was at Columbia yesterday. Now, was that a political stunt? Sure, but politics is a performative business. Go to the university, go nearby, and say, look, I want everyone to have the right to protest. And I also have sympathy for what's going on right now with the people in Gaza. And I want more to be done for humanitarian aid. And I have my problems with the Israeli government. But this moral equivalency is crazy. Israel is not the oppressor here, okay? Israel and Hamas are not the same. There's no justification for what happened on October 7th. Hamas is an evil terrorist organization that hides among its civilians and allows them to be killed. And Israel is trying to preserve innocent Palestinian life. You may not think they're doing enough. That's fine. But they are trying as best they can to not kill civilians and go after Gaza. And it's not the same. And it's wrong to say it's the same. Like there's an opening for Biden there to do that. On the trans issue, there's an opening for him to come out and say, look, I support anyone, who especially if they're an adult who wants to go through this, and they should be accepted with love and dignity and all that. But I don't think it's a good idea for, 17-year-old people who were born male to be competing in female sports. So there's an opportunity for Biden, I think, on some of these issues to have his sister soldier moment that Clinton had and look down the more extreme elements of his base and say, no, this is too far. I think that would do Biden a lot of good. I think it's the right thing to do, A, but B, I think politically it could help him blunt some of that sentiment of the left that I think it helps Trump.
Yeah, I do think you need more people on the left doing that and speaking out against some of those things. And you're mentioning some kind of LGBTQ type situations, and we've had a lot of discussions on the radio over the last couple of years about this. I'll have friends. We have this group chat that can get political, and it's kind of fun. And we all do it amongst friends. But like anytime something is done that's really stupid on the right or left, somebody will put it in the group text and they'll basically ask, hey, you Republicans, speak to this, defend this, or hey, Democrats, speak to this. And I always laugh because I always remember like Family Feud. Family Feud was always, we asked 100 people. And I like doing polls on X because I always like to say, let's ask 100 people. Because, for example, you mentioned Drag Queen Story Hour, like let's say the Leah Thomas swimming story, and then like 5-year-olds with their gender identity. If you did this just of Democrats, if you did Family Feud with Democrats, I mean, what percentage you think agrees with any of that? And I feel like so. Let's say I'm a Democrat. I have to wear that, like, oh, I believe in that. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's so dumb.
Right.
And I don't know the percentage. Drag Queen Story Hour. I guess you're allowed to do it. I wouldn't certainly take my kids there. And I don't think, I mean, I bet you would be less than 5%, maybe less than 1% of Democrats. But now it's talked about like, hey, we all love Drag Queen Story Hour. No.
Right.
Hey, everybody thinks Leah Thomas should be the 300th best dude and then switch the next year and win the NCAA championship. No, no, I don't think that at all. And
Yeah.
I don't think a huge percentage of Democrats think that. So this is my real thing with the whole trans issue. Whatever whatever percentage of people that actually are trans, whether it's 1%, 0.5%, and I have a lot of empathy for those folks. You know, doctors say you have these kids that are going through this gender dysphoria, whatever it is. God, my heart hurts for those kids. I wish we'd stop talking about it, honestly, because I feel like it's like 50% of the media oxygen out there for something that's like 0.5%. And I'm going to bring this up real quick as I kind of fell into an opinion here because I had this graphic in my phone, and I think this speaks to. I'll put it up as well, but it's about how media coverage affects our perception. So basically, they asked a bunch of people, kind of like this Family Feud type situation, how many people are transgender? The true proportion is 1%. The American public thought that 21% of people were transgender. Think about that.
Wow.
They
That's
think
crazy.
they think 1 in 5 people essentially are transgender. That's because it's all you fricking see in the media. It's 1% or less.
Yeah. And some of that is conservatives. They're part of the people talking about it, right? They're making it too a
Sure.
bigger issue than it probably is. It's a complicated issue, and again, I think Biden doesn't really talk about it, and that's probably the right play for the president, right? Like, this is something that should be sorted out at the local level and amongst people and their families. It's incredibly complex, and different medical professionals have different opinions about this, and there isn't a lot of data yet on it. There isn't a lot of good data on children who are trans. I think some of it certainly is comes from the immense exposure that it's gotten on social media. I don't think there's any question about that because you're right that the numbers may be 1%, but if you look at surveys among like high school girls now, there are surveys that show it's 10 or 15 or 20% that identify as transgender. And I don't think that we have seen that big of a rise in transgenderism over the last 5 or 10 years. I just don't buy that. I think some of it is what you're saying, social media. And I think Biden mostly ignoring it is fine, and Trump mostly ignoring it is fine. But there are, again, points where you can wade in, where you can show both your empathy and compassion, and you can talk about the complexity of the issue. But at the same time, you can call out the extreme of your party or your movement or your side. But the downside of that is, and we know what it is, we have become so fractured and the extremes have gotten so much more powerful. And you see this on the Republican side too. Marjorie Taylor Greene's a great example, right? The extremes have gotten so powerful that it is harder and harder to stare them down and call them out when they are over the top. I was watching TV the other night and I saw a drag queen with little kids. By the way, I want to be clear. I have no problem with drag queens. I have no problem with drag queen story hour for adults. I guess I have no problem if you personally want to take your kid to see a drag queen read a story. Would I do it, for 6-year old, 7-year old? No. But the drag queen was up there with the kids in the audience shouting free Palestine. And I'm like, that is like the ultimate conservative caricature, right? Like I wasn't sure if this was real or if this was like an actor that conservatives had paid and like they paid all the kids to come in, but apparently it was real. And I'm like, this is first of all, this is interesting on so many levels. One of them being that a drag queen in Palestine, quote unquote, like that ran into Hamas, wouldn't do very well, right?
Right.
So when I see the drag queens for Palestine, that makes me laugh a little bit. But yeah, it was basically like a caricature that would be dreamed up by conservatives. But I think I know that we are siloed, and I know there's a lot of power on the extremes. But even with that, especially when you've already got the nomination, right? And I'd say the same thing for Trump with some of the more extreme elements of his party, although in some ways he's aligned with a lot of them. You have a little bit of flexibility here. You have a little bit of room to reach in and call out the most extreme stuff on your side in order to appeal toward the middle. It's the right thing to do, in my opinion, and it's good politics.
All right, you mentioned Marge there. We're over an hour here, so I'll do the old empty your notebook. I know you maybe had some thoughts on Marge Green and also Ukraine, that aid package.
Oh, I've got a lot of thoughts on Margie Green. Tom Tillis, who's senator from North Carolina, said she's destroying our brand, basically. And he said if we lose, it's not the Democrats we have to worry about, it's her. And I think he's generally right. That's, we talked to Earl a few minutes ago about some of the things holding back the left. Well, this is one of the things holding back Republicans is their extremes also have a lot of power. And you saw it on the Ukraine vote, which, by the way, thank God it finally got across the finish line. And Mike Johnson, man, I I've turned around my opinion on him. I was not a fan. I thought I mean, he was such a wuss early on. Like, basically, never wanted to challenge his own party, kicking the can down the road on all these issues, never really making a decision. But in the last few weeks, he has kind of come full circle, and he stood up to the base of his party and basically said, and again, I want to be clear when I say base, it was a minority view in his party, especially among Republicans, that didn't want funding for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. And he stood up and said, no, we're going to do this. And I shouldn't say, it was basically 50-50. Almost half the Republicans voted against it on Ukraine aid, and almost half voted for it. In the Senate, more than half Republicans voted for it, and they got it through. And good for him, because sometimes, and Marjorie Taylor Greene is threatening him now this week that he either needs to resign or there will be a motion to vacate, which is essentially to eliminate him as speaker, remove him as speaker. I hope that if that happens, Democrats vote, and I think some will. I think enough Democrats will vote to save his job, and they should, because he stood out, put his neck out there to pass this Ukraine aid. And I hope that if it comes to it, the Democrats do support him, because we can't go without a speaker for 3 or 4 weeks like we did last year with all the craziness we have going on in the world right now. And so kudos to Johnson for basically doing the right thing, but B, then looking and staring down the people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and saying, you know what, do what you got to do, because that's how you have to have these jobs. That's what you have to do in these jobs. You can't be afraid walking around, because you'll never be able to show power or get anything done. You have to risk it in order to do it effectively. If you're not willing to risk it, then with this narrow majority, you're not going to be able to do the things that need to get done. And look, the Ukraine aid, it I understand the people who say we need to focus on our border, our issues. Sure, absolutely. But Ukraine, you've seen Russia make advances over the last few weeks, the last few months, while Ukraine was waiting on this aid. Do we really want to let Russia win there? Is that really in the best interests of the United States of America? I think the answer to that is clearly no, for a number of reasons. And it's sad that the Republican Party, a large chunk of it, is now in the camp of doing what Putin and Russia want. Right? That's what you're doing. You are doing what Putin and Russia want. You are helping them, whether you mean to or not. That is the net effect of the position that you are advocating. And it's just weird to see the Republican Party, that for like the party of Ronald Reagan, like, again, the ultimate Cold Warrior, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, the man who stood up to communism. The party of George W. Bush, whether you agree or disagree, sending troops to fight, essentially to make countries into democracies, right? That was kind of the end goal in Iraq and Afghanistan, was get them to be thriving democracies, obviously with some, mixed results, poor results when it came to Afghanistan. But whether you agree or disagree with it, it's just so weird to see that Republican Party now be the party of, who cares if
Eh,
Putin wins? It doesn't affect us, right? A democracy falls. Maybe Putin's emboldened. Maybe, China's emboldened by this. It's okay, because our border's a mess. It's a really weird place for the Republican Party to go to, like, in my lifetime.
well said, Eric Messersmith. This is Everybody Settle Down. Thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, share the video, share the show, put it in your group chat, put it on social media, get the word out. We're having a good month here. We're growing nice and slow and steady, Eric. It's great to see, and we'll see you next week, sir. Take it easy.